thank Mike for his speech and now look to Simone van Teutem, Standing Committee, Merton College, to close the case for the opposition.
One year ago, Ravneet Singh was queuing outside of Parliament. He wanted to meet one of the MPs. A man came up to him, shouted in his face, and tried to grab his turban. Last August, a group of thugs attacked two young Muslim girls in the streets of Dublin. They snatched off their hijabs, they pelted them with eggs, and they kicked them while they were on the ground. As recently as 2 months ago, an Orthodox Jewish man in Brooklyn, New York, was bashed with a chair and assaulted by a group of criminals. Now, what's the common denominator here? There are three, actually. All the victims were harmless citizens. All of these victims were peacefully practicing their religion in public life. And all of these victims had their most basic rights viciously violated. I'm standing here in front of you today as a non-religious person myself to defend these basic rights. But before doing so, I'd like to once more clarify this motion. The proposition, and even some of the speakers on the floor, would like you to think that this is about government taking side on religious issues, that this is about states sponsoring evil ideas, that this is about oppressing homosexuals or feminists or women in general. They'd like you to think that it's only about religious people forcing their religion down atheist throats. And you know what? I would be fine with banning all of that from public life. I would be totally fine with that. But this motion goes way, way beyond this. This motion tells us that religion has no place at all in public life. It tells us that in our schools, we can't have any religious dialogue. It tells us that in our public libraries, we cannot have any religious texts. It tells us that on our streets, there is no room for religious prayer and no room for peaceful religious festivals. There is no room for religious symbols, such as the turban that Ravneet was wearing outside of Parliament. And it falls upon our side of the house to show you today that public life should and must at least allow some place for religion. That is what this debate is about. And I think that my case can be summed up by 3 simple points. First of all, some public expressions of religion are valuable for society and do not inflict any harm upon our citizens. Secondly, these expressions do not promote or condone any of the problems raised by the proposition today. They do not condone oppression, they do not condone religious extremism. And lastly, pushing religion into the private sphere will actually worsen the oppression and the problems raised by proposition today. So, let's start. Why are some public expressions of religions valuable in society? It's very simple. They are valuable to many members of society. For many people, religion is an anchor of identity. Expressing and celebrating it in public life brings religious people deep satisfaction because it allows them to take pride in their culture. It gives them a sense of belonging because it shows to them that their fellow citizens can accept them for who they are in the public space. Diwali, for instance, celebrates the spiritual victory of light over darkness, of good over evil, and of knowledge over ignorance. It gives Hindu men and women the opportunity to express beliefs that they feel are at the core of their very identity. And they do not inflict any harm on anyone. And yet, the honorable speakers of proposition side today want us to turn to our Hindu brothers and sisters and say, there is no place for Diwali in public life. This stance simply fails to respectfully recognize Hindu culture. Has anyone here read Animal Farm? Yes. Proposition here is telling us that we are all free and equal citizens, but the atheists among us are just a bit more free and equal than others. Aside from identity, festivals like Diwali add a sense of meaning to our public interaction. They encourage people to do good, even in its smallest and simplest forms. So in my primary school, once a year, a Jewish girl, Noah, would treat everyone to slices of apple and honey for Rosh Hashanah. It was a very small gesture, a simple act of kindness. But small gestures in public life are more important than ever today. Day by day, it is becoming increasingly difficult for us to meaningfully interact with each other in the public sphere. And why is that? I think you know it as well. It's because of our phones. I challenge each and every one of you to take a look around you after this debate. Whether you're on the bus, go to the bar, whether you go to a restaurant, look around you and just observe. You will see a bunch of zombies glued to phones, sucking the soul out of their bodies. Harmless religious practices, such as Rosh Hashanah or Diwali, do the exact opposite. They remind us how important it is to openly and actively celebrate life together. And yet, the honorable members of proposition here today would rather have Noah leave her apples and honey at home, only because her kind act was religiously motivated. And this brings me to my second point, because the problem is not so much with these independent acts, it's with the fact that these independent acts are part of a larger religious framework. Peaceful religious symbols and festivals are guilty by association. Wearing a cross in public life may in itself not directly inflict any harm on others, but it promotes religion or Christianity as a whole. Now this is nonsense, because as with any broad doctrine, it makes no sense to speak of Christianity as a whole. There are countless different interpretations of the Bible, and different Christians hold different sets of belief. The sheer semantic categorization under one name should not lead to stigmatization of individual religious acts. Imagine if we would extend this logic to other cases. 40 years ago, John Lennon was murdered by a lunatic who said that he was inspired by A Catcher in the Rye. Should we ban that book from public space as well, just because some people have used it for the wrong intentions? Of course not. Speaking about books, last night I was reading one, and in it was See, I'm at Merton College, and famously we like to sleep with books rather than people. Anyway, in this book that I was reading was a speech by Adlai Stevenson. The year was 1952, and he said, "The tragedy of our life today is a climate of fear in which we live, and fear breeds repression. Too often, our sinister threats to the Bill of Rights, to freedom of the mind, concealed under the cloak of anti-communism. Today, it is the cloak of anti-terrorism. People use and abuse this cloak to spread suppression, intolerance, and hatred. And the hypocrisy about that would be laughable if only it wasn't so destructive to people like Rob Need. We must not compromise, we must never compromise on our basic rights because a small minority of aggressive fools. And that small minority of aggressive fools brings me to my last point. Because eliminating religion from public life does not only undermine the value of harmless religious practices, it also exacerbates the problems we face with religion today. The problems that were actually raised by proposition today. Why do you think that people join ISIS? One of the key reasons is frustration towards the West. Now, marginalizing minority groups is the quickest and easiest way of pushing people like that deeper or quicker into terrorism, because a thirst for revenge is never born in a vacuum. Revenge is necessarily responsive. It is fueled by anger and dissatisfaction with the system. And denying people their peaceful, harmless rituals in public life will not mitigate their anger. It will exacerbate it. And what about freedom of education? This motion entails that we cut religion out of the conversation. Now tell me, how are kids going to scrutinize their parents' religious ideas or provide them with context if they cannot study them critically in schools? This allows fundamentalists to preserve the purity of their faith among their children. And our democracy crucially depends on informed citizenship, also when it comes to religion, especially when it comes to religion. Now see, my father died 2 years ago, and I'm very sad that he's not here today. But when he was on his deathbed, he said to me, "You must always use your rights and talents to stand up for people more vulnerable than you are." Today, all I'm doing is urging all of you to do the same. This institution can send a signal into the world that we do not stand by hate crimes. We do not give in to it. And I urge you to walk out of this chamber in a minute or two and vote no. We do not stand by while the rights of our religious brothers and sisters are violated. It is simply not good enough.